Eliseo Gil and Idoia Filoi were abruptly removed as directors of the Iruña Veleia excavation by Basque government. They were also taken to court. Do you think that their excavation methodology at Iruña Veleia archaeological site was appropriate?
Absolutely. I have reviewed their reports, and it is quite clear that they used the stratigraphic method, including the compilation of Harris matrix diagrams, which represent the stratigraphic sequence of a site. I would like to go back a bit and simply review the overall matter in archaeology. The fact is that before the 1950s, while people understood stratigraphy and the necessity to excavate stratigraphically, very few archaeologists actually did that. And more importantly, they didn't record stratigraphically, that is to say, by the stratigraphic method. Now, there are many archaeologists, unfortunately, who still use what is called the arbitrary method of excavation. That is to say, in comparison to the stratigraphic method, the arbitrary method means that you excavate in predetermined levels rather than following the natural flow, if you will, of the stratification of a site. We now know that, of course, that one of the most important elements that was missing in recording archaeological sites was the recording of surfaces. And the importance of this is that when you reconstruct a site, you have to reconstruct the surfaces in the first instance, because people live on surfaces. It is the buildup of surfaces over time that makes up the living surfaces, the living periods of a site. And to a large degree, these were not recorded, and they certainly weren't recorded for every stratigraphic unit. Certainly when I was learning archaeology, we made what were called composite plans. So it was decided during the excavation, rather than after the fact of excavation, what would be the period surface of a site. This was disastrous in several ways because it meant that the surface you had recorded was not necessarily a true period surface, that is to say, all the surfaces that were in use at that time. We began to realize in the 1970s that you had to record every surface of every stratigraphic unit if you were able to or wish to reconstruct the topography, the landscape of a site. This arose primarily because, being diggers or excavators, we concentrated on what you could dig up, and we completely missed the fact that surfaces, being immaterial, that is to say, surfaces don't exist, particularly in the record, unless you record them, because you excavate them away as you dig up the deposit which has the artifacts contained within them. So if one looks back over the years, one can say that many or most excavations around the world prior to the 1950s, even 60s, you cannot reconstruct the site. You cannot reconstruct the experiment, if you will, which is what you should be able to do, because of course future archaeologists will come back and look at earlier excavations and their records and make different determinations on the periodization of the site. Now, any such later analysis does not change the stratigraphic sequence of the site as found by the first excavator. That stratigraphic sequence, which is a diagram of time, which we can now express in a Harris matrix, is the testing pattern against which all later analyses are done. when it comes to the work in the Basque Country done recently and which has led to claims of forgery, it is quite clear that the archaeologists used the stratigraphic method, which is the only method that one should use in excavating archaeological sites. This is not a question of having two cases to answer, that both sides could be right, the people who excavate arbitrarily and people who don't excavate but excavate stratigraphically somehow both have a valid case. This is not the case, particularly where you have complex, that is to say, many thousands of units of stratifications, such as our Iruña Veleia. I examined the reports done by the archaeologists who are now, in my view, falsely accused of forging artifacts. I have examined their reports, and it seems to me quite clear from their reports that they conducted their excavations by the stratigraphic method, the only correct and proper way in which to excavate, and that they did a superb job in doing so. This is apparent through the photographs in the excavations, the compilation of their stratigraphic sequences done during the course of excavation, and other information contained in the reports that made it quite clear that these two archaeologists knew exactly what they were doing and that they did it correct and properly. When it comes to the question of the artifacts forged, apparently forged, or claimed to be forged or otherwise, one can then say with confidence that if the archaeologists say these artifacts were found in certain deposits at certain levels, and they can point to the level in the deposit in the stratigraphic sequence, that their evidence is correct and is true. Now, the nature of the artifacts, of course, is the question for experts who look into various different types of artifacts and analyze them, be they coins, pieces of pottery, ecofacts like bones, and so forth. But any such analysis has to be done in relationship to the stratigraphic sequence or the Harris matrix. The reason for this is that artifacts are not reliable in the way that stratigraphic units are. No one goes out to create stratification. It's a natural byproduct of living and building. And so if you get that right, and you isolate the artifacts to the deposits in which they're found, you then have the unique stratigraphic sequence, which you can consider in a way as a sort of DNA model for every site, and every site has a unique one. You can then analyze the artifacts to decide whether, within the context of the deposit they're in, whether they're contemporary with it, or whether they're contamination that may have got into the deposit by tree roots or whatever other source, or whether they're residual, that is to say, someone excavated material near the site the archaeologists are working on in the past, and they redeposited that material while making new stratification or new deposits or building a new house, and therefore earlier artifacts have gotten into later deposits. But this is the purpose of stratification and doing the stratigraphic method, because it provides the testing pattern and the check against the evidence of the artifacts. If in some deposits you looked at artifacts in isolation, that is to say, just in relationship to the deposit in which they were found, you might make a claim for the date of that deposit, which is completely erroneous, because the artifacts are contamination or they're residual, so they're much earlier than the deposit. But this is one of the major issues that archaeologists have to sort out. So I have every confidence that the archaeologists who are now accused falsely, in my view, of forgery, carried out their excavations in the best stratigraphic methods available at the time.
Okay, so other archaeologists from Basque Country University had previously been in charge of this excavation from 1987 to 1993, before Idoia and Eliseo were appointed. In this period, Harris matrix wasn't used for strata timing because, in terms of Professor Azcárate, director, it wasn't useful. This previous excavation uh, has officially accused Eliseo and Idoia of using a bad stratification methodology. Is that what you were talking about? Could you give an opinion on that?
I would disagree with such a statement. I haven't seen the whole context of what the professor said, but the a bad stratigraphic method is simply not to do it stratigraphically. They were working in the stratigraphic method, which means they were doing it right. A bad stratigraphic method is what I termed as arbitrary excavation. It's not even bad, it's totally incorrect and will falsify the data. And as I pointed out earlier, it destroys the surfaces. If you think of an analogy of Humpty Dumpty sitting on the wall and he falls off and the egg breaks, when you're putting the egg back together again, when you're reconstructing it, you don't care what's in the inside, what's in the yolk and so forth. What you're interested in is the surfaces. And if you haven't recorded the surfaces, you cannot put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And it's the same with an archaeological site. If you have not recorded the surfaces, you cannot reconstruct the site. Any number of section drawings, profiles through the site, you can have thousands of them. You cannot reconstruct the surfaces correctly and true by combining sections and so on. It can only be done from the top, from the surfaces. And this is what ties into the stratigraphic methods, because we cannot excavate sideways. So we have to, if you're going to excavate properly, stratigraphically, that is to say, you remove the latest deposits, units, walls, whatever stratigraphic units are, the latest ones are removed first. You have to work from the top down. And the advantage now with the stratigraphic sequence is as you excavate, you can make a Harris matrix or stratigraphic sequence as you excavate. In previous years, archaeologists did that or tried to do it after the fact. Although we can quite clearly say now, and we could have some students look into the literature, but the fact of the matter is that the term stratigraphic sequence was very seldom used. It was not very often used until we revised things with the Harris matrix. So the statement that they used a bad stratigraphic method is an incorrect one in a way. Either you're using the stratigraphic method or you're not. Now, what they could be doing or could have been doing is excavating stratigraphically and correctly, but they weren't recording stratigraphically and correctly. So, for example, if they weren't recording surfaces, they were doing bad recording. Not bad stratigraphic, they were doing bad, inadequate recording. All of this comes down to the question of evidence. And in a way, this ties in with the whole question of forgery. When one is going into court, you have to have evidence. One side has the evidence, one side has other evidence or thinks they have, and so on. You have to have evidence. And the fact is that I believe that if the records of the work that these two archaeologists did was put in evidence in court, that they would win the case versus someone who doesn't have their stratigraphic records and so on. This is a matter that is going to come more and more to the fore, particularly with things like forensic archaeology, working on sites of mass burials and so on of modern times. There are still archaeologists who are excavating these sites arbitrarily. That is to say, they're destroying the surfaces before you can record them. And their evidence will not stand up in court. And it will happen sooner or later that if you have a case of this sort and archaeologists are presenting their data, and if they haven't excavated stratigraphically, if they haven't recorded stratigraphically, they will lose the case. And I'm perfectly willing to be an expert witness, as they say in the United States. But the fact of the matter is that we now know that we have principles of archaeological stratigraphy, not geology, not anything else, but our own professional methods. They are there for all to see, to learn, and to use. And I believe the two archaeologists at Iruña did it properly.
And Professor Núñez was appointed director after Idoia and Eliseo were sacked. He has removed and disposed strata 1 meter deep with a bulldozer. This part of the site had previously been improved by Eliseo and Idoia to contain intact strata at only 30 centimeters depth. Do you think that by doing this, Núñez has damaged the archaeological heritage of the Basque Country?
In former times, it was often considered the thing to do. So, for example, and in some instances, the situation was forced on archaeologists. So, for example, in Britain, if someone was interested in the Roman deposits, say in London or some other place, you would bulldoze everything on top of that. Well, of course, in doing that, you're absolutely destroying history and heritage. You're basically, in your stratigraphic sequence, you'd have a great blank where the information is missing. And so you might have recorded the top of the site before you started work, and then you're recording the Roman. So in between, you've got a great big blank, digging and destroying the site, consigning it to oblivion. Well, there are instances where that is justified from the point of view of time. Say, for example, if one was working in front of the bulldozers at a road scheme or something, and there's some reason why you felt that on that particular site, the Roman period or some earlier period was the most important, and that the other material on top of it should be removed and not excavated. This is certainly not justified on a site like Iruña, which is not threatened, except perhaps by archaeologists. It's an open field site, if you will. No one is threatening to put a Ritz-Carlton hotel on top of the site. There is no reason for not excavating from the top, working your way down, and getting the full stratigraphic sequence for the site. There's no justification for it. These sites are of great interest, not just for their Roman deposits, but for later things as well. And in fact, in some sites like this, it's the later material which is far more important for history, because some of these were built up in periods that we used to call the Dark Ages, where very little was known about what was happening on the site at that time. So if you're going to do your job correctly on a site that's unprotected, you start excavating at the top, at the grass, and you excavate everything. And that way you get a complete stratigraphic sequence. You record all the surfaces, which makes it possible for you to reconstruct the site at that particular area throughout its entire history into the present day.